It was a warm summer evening in Dublin, Ireland, July 20th, 2017. Emergency services raced through the quiet streets of Coolock, their sirens piercing the evening air. When Dublin Fire Brigade arrived at a modest apartment complex on Rathvale Drive, they were met by a man in his underwear, claiming his partner had hurt herself. Inside, they found 27-year-old mother of two Amadea McDermott with a fatal stab wound to her body. The man, 34-year-old gravedigger, Martin Hayes, told a simple story. Amadea inflicted this wound on herself. Case closed, right? Not so fast. What investigators uncovered over the next 3 years revealed one of the most sophisticated cases of digital stalking and coercive control in Irish criminal history. In this story, you will see where a hidden smartphone app would ultimately expose a killer and deliver justice for a young mother whose voice had been silenced forever. This is the story of how modern technology became both a weapon of terror and the key to unlocking the truth. But before we dive deep into this digital nightmare, let me remind you that this case involves sensitive content related to domestic violence. If you or someone you know needs help, please reach out to local support services. That said, let's dive into the story. Amadea McDermott was more than just a statistic. She was a vibrant 27-year-old woman trying to navigate the complex world of modern motherhood while maintaining her independence. Living in the airfield area of Coolock, she was part of a close-knit community where neighbors knew each other and families looked out for one another. For 10 years, Amadea had been in a relationship with Martin Hayes, a gravedigger from the Kimmage area of Dublin. To outsiders, they appeared to be a typical couple dealing with the everyday challenges of raising children and building a life together. But behind closed doors, a much darker reality was unfolding. Hayes had what would later be described as a very specific pattern when it came to relationships. He would meet women, move quickly toward pregnancy and commitment, and then begin a slow but steady campaign of control. This wasn't the explosive, obvious abuse that people often imagine when they think of domestic violence. Instead, it was a methodical erosion of independence, so gradual that victims often didn't recognize what was happening until they were deeply trapped. The relationship between Hayes and Amadea had reached a critical juncture in the weeks leading up to her death. She had begun what experts call pushing back against his control. This pushback had resulted in Hayes moving out of their shared home approximately 2 weeks before the fatal incident. For Amadea, this separation likely felt like the first breath of freedom she'd had in years. For Hayes, it represented an unacceptable loss of control that would trigger his most dangerous impulses. July 20th, 2017, started like any other summer day in Dublin. Amadea had made plans to get her nails done, a simple act of self-care that most people would consider completely routine. But for someone living under the constant surveillance that Hayes had established, even this innocent appointment would become a flashpoint for violence. Hayes, despite no longer living in the home, somehow knew about Amadea's nail appointment. How he obtained this information would later become a crucial piece of evidence in understanding the true nature of their relationship. When first responders arrived at the scene that evening, they found Hayes in a state of apparent shock, wearing only his underwear and claiming that Amadea had inflicted the fatal wound on herself. The scene that greeted emergency responders was one that would be seared into their memories forever. Amadea lay motionless in her apartment, a single stab wound having ended her life. The wound was severe enough to cause rapid blood loss, and despite the quick response of emergency services, there was nothing they could do to save her. Hayes' behavior during those first crucial minutes raised immediate red flags for experienced first responders. His emotional responses seemed scripted rather than genuine, and several physical details didn't align with his account of events. Most importantly, when fire brigade personnel arrived, they found him in his underwear, yet he later told police he had been fully clothed during the incident and even provided those clothes as evidence. The positioning of the knife also struck investigators as unusual. Rather than being dropped or discarded as might be expected in a moment of crisis, the weapon had been placed deliberately in the center of the kitchen table. This careful positioning suggested a level of thought and planning that contradicted Hayes' narrative of a spontaneous, self-inflicted tragedy. The initial post-mortem examination conducted by state pathologist Professor Marie Cassidy presented a significant challenge for investigators. While she could confirm that Amadea had died from the stab wound, the nature of the injury meant she couldn't definitively determine whether it had been inflicted by another person or was self-inflicted. In many cases, this ambiguity might have led to the investigation being closed as inconclusive. However, the investigators at Coolock Garda Station, led by Detective Sergeant Anthony Maloney, made a crucial decision. Despite the pathologist's inability to make a definitive determination, they would treat this as a potential homicide investigation. Every piece of evidence was preserved, every witness statement was documented, and every detail was photographed and catalogued. This decision to maintain the investigation's integrity would prove absolutely crucial 3 years later when new technology and fresh witness testimony breathed new life into the case. The crime scene photographs taken in 2017 would become vital evidence in 2020, and the meticulous documentation of Hayes' statements and behavior would reveal inconsistencies that might otherwise have been forgotten. During the initial investigation, Hayes' mobile phone was seized as standard procedure. At the time, the technology to fully examine the device's contents wasn't as advanced as it would become by 2020. The phone sat in evidence storage, holding secrets that wouldn't be unlocked for 3 years. Meanwhile, investigators began the painstaking process of mapping Hayes' relationship history. What they discovered was a man who had refined his methods of control through multiple relationships, each one teaching him more effective ways to manipulate and dominate his partners. One former partner revealed how Hayes had pressured her to abandon her iPhone in favor of a Samsung device. At the time, she thought it was simply his preference or perhaps a financial consideration. She had no way of knowing that this seemingly innocent request was actually part of a calculated plan to gain access to surveillance capabilities that would allow him to monitor her every move. Another former partner described how Hayes had pushed her down the stairs during an argument. This physical violence demonstrated that when his psychological control methods failed, he was willing to escalate to direct physical harm. The turning point in the investigation came in 2020, 3 years after Amadea's death, when advances in digital forensics technology allowed investigators to conduct a more thorough examination of Hayes' seized mobile phone. What they discovered hidden in the device's data would transform the entire case. Buried deep within the phone's memory, forensic experts found evidence of a sophisticated tracking application that Hayes had secretly installed on Amadea's Samsung device. This wasn't just a simple location tracker or the kind of family safety app that many couples use openly. This was invasive spyware designed to provide complete surveillance of another person's digital life. The application gave Hayes unprecedented access to Amadea's private world. Every text message she sent or received was instantly available to him. Every phone call could be monitored and recorded. Her physical location was tracked in real time wherever she went. Most insidiously, the app provided him with notifications whenever she received messages on social media platforms like Instagram, allowing him to monitor her social interactions even when she thought she was communicating privately with friends. Perhaps most chilling of all, Hayes could access all of this information remotely from any internet-connected device. This meant that even when he wasn't physically present, even after he had moved out of their shared home, he maintained constant surveillance over Amadea's life. She had no private moments, no confidential conversations, no escape from his watchful digital eye. The sophistication of this surveillance setup revealed a level of premeditation and calculation that contradicted Hayes' portrayal of himself as someone who had simply lost control in a moment of passion. This was systematic, deliberate, and had likely been ongoing for months or even years before Amadea's death. Through his constant surveillance of Amadea's communications, Hayes began developing what the trial judge would later describe as an obsession. He became convinced, without any basis in reality, that Amadea was involved in an inappropriate relationship with a family member. This false belief, fed by his paranoid interpretation of innocent family interactions and conversations, consumed his thoughts and drove his increasingly erratic behavior. The dangerous thing about surveillance-based obsessions is how they can distort reality. When someone has access to every text message, every phone call, and every social media interaction, they begin to read sinister meanings into completely innocent communications. A casual text to a family member becomes evidence of conspiracy. A friendly conversation becomes proof of betrayal. Hayes had created a prison of paranoia for himself, where every piece of information he gathered through his illegal surveillance confirmed his worst suspicions. This obsession reached its peak on July 20, 2017. Hayes had used his surveillance capabilities to monitor Amadea's plans for the day. When he discovered she intended to get her nails done, something about this simple act of self-care triggered his violent response. Perhaps it represented independence he couldn't tolerate, or maybe it was connected to his paranoid beliefs about her relationships. Whatever the trigger, it would lead to a confrontation that ended with Amadea's death. The argument that ensued was likely more intense than any Hayes had experienced before. This wasn't just about nail appointments or daily plans. This was about control, obsession, and a man who couldn't accept that the woman he claimed to love was trying to reclaim her independence. The violence that followed would end not just Amadea's life, but Hayes' freedom as well. As the investigation progressed through 2018 and 2019, detectives began weaving together a complex web of digital evidence, witness testimony, and behavioral analysis that painted a damning picture of Hayes' actions. The witness who came forward in 2018 provided crucial information about the night of the killing that had previously been unavailable to investigators. The re-examination of crime scene evidence revealed details that hadn't been fully appreciated during the initial investigation. The positioning of the knife, Hayes' inconsistent statements about his clothing, and the timeline of his actions all began to form a coherent narrative that contradicted his claims of innocence. Perhaps most importantly, the discovery of the tracking app provided investigators with a motive that explained the seemingly senseless violence. This wasn't a random act of passion or a moment of lost control. This was the culmination of years of systematic abuse and surveillance, triggered by Hayes' paranoid obsessions and his inability to accept Amadea's growing independence. The investigation also revealed the sophisticated nature of Hayes' controlling behavior. His preference for Samsung devices over iPhones wasn't random, it was strategic. Android devices are more vulnerable to the installation of unauthorized surveillance applications, making them ideal tools for digital stalking. Hayes had likely researched these capabilities and deliberately steered his partners toward devices he could more easily compromise. Even Hayes' supporters began to abandon him as the full scope of his actions became clear during the trial. Some actually left the courtroom upon learning about the surveillance app and the extent of his controlling behavior. After his conviction, 2 jury members returned for the sentencing hearing, reportedly disgusted by what they had learned about his treatment of Amadea. The conviction of Martin Hayes for the manslaughter of Amadea McDermott represented more than just individual justice. It marked an important precedent in how the Irish legal system approaches cases involving digital surveillance and coercive control. The successful prosecution demonstrated that law enforcement agencies are adapting to recognize and investigate technology-enabled abuse. Retired Detective Superintendent Paul Scott praised the exemplary work of the investigation team, noting how the new information received in 2018 led to a comprehensive review that ultimately resulted in Hayes' conviction. He also commended Amadea's family for their dignity throughout the trial process and their eloquent testimony about the woman they had lost. The case has also highlighted the need for stronger legal protections against coercive control. Advocate Jason Poole, whose sister Jennifer was killed by her ex-partner in a similar case in 2021, has called for mandatory sentences in cases where coercive control leads to fatal violence. His advocacy represents a growing movement to recognize that domestic violence fatalities are often the predictable endpoint of escalating patterns of abuse that could be interrupted with proper intervention. Hayes' recent decision to appeal his conviction has reopened old wounds for Amadea's family. Legal experts note that while appeals are a standard part of the justice system, they place additional emotional and psychological burdens on families who are still grieving their losses. The appeal process could take months or even years to resolve, extending the family's ordeal indefinitely. As we conclude this examination of the Amadea McDermott case, it's important to remember that this story represents far more than just one tragic incident. It's a window into the evolving nature of domestic abuse in the digital age, where smartphones and applications can become tools of terror and control. It's also a testament to the dedication of investigators who refuse to give up on finding the truth, even when that truth seemed elusive. If you're watching this video and recognize signs of coercive control in your own life or the life of someone you care about, please know that help is available. Digital surveillance, isolation from friends and family, and controlling behavior around technology use are all warning signs that should be taken seriously. Modern domestic violence often leaves digital fingerprints, and law enforcement agencies are becoming increasingly sophisticated in their ability to detect and prosecute these crimes. The story of Amadea McDermott reminds us that behind every criminal case are real people whose lives have been forever changed by violence. While we may never be able to bring Amadea back, we can honor her memory by learning from her story and working to prevent similar tragedies from occurring in the future. Thank you for joining me for this deep dive into one of Ireland's most complex domestic violence cases. If you found this investigation compelling, please subscribe for more detailed examinations of true crime cases that reveal the intersection of technology, psychology, and justice. Until next time, stay safe and stay informed.